Good afternoon. I'm Jonathan Anton, and I am standing in for my colleague Calvin Sharp, who is the founding director of the Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution. Unfortunately, Calvin can't be here this afternoon because of a death in the family, which I really regret, both because he is a close friend and because this program is really his doing. Every year, Sister sponsors several lectures. One of those lectures is an interdisciplinary lecture given by a scholar in a field other than the law to feature a perspective from outside the law that might nevertheless be valuable to lawyers in thinking about conflict and conflict resolution. Today's lecturer has done some of the most important work in explaining the cultural performance, the role that cultural performance and memory play in escalating and de-escalating ethnic conflict and testing various social science theories of conflict and their implications for conflict management. Our speaker today has written or edited 8 books in this area and has written dozens of articles. Marc Howard Ross is the William Rand Kenan Professor of Political Science at Bryn Mawr College. We are honored to have him with us this afternoon to speak on the subject collective memory, how the present shapes the past, told through a Philadelphia story about George Washington and slavery. Professor Ross, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I think it's the first time I've actually spoken at a law school, so I always enjoy new experiences. And what I want to do is talk to you about work that I've been doing over the last few years on a particular case right near my hometown, my house. And the reason I moved to this in part was because a friend of mine told me, you keep studying ethnic conflicts in other places and it makes some of us feel like we're exotic and you don't have this same stuff in your own backyard. So the site I'm going to talk about, Independence Hall National Park, is a mile from where I live, and it's got as much conflict as many other places. Well, I'm interested in collective memory and narratives. They perform the backdrop for this, and I'll say things about them on and off, but I mainly want to get you engaged in the case and have you think about the complicated kinds of questions, the politics of this, and I guess some of the legal aspects also that are involved. I'm interested in narratives and how people describe themselves and their experiences. And you go anywhere and you can find textbooks, anywhere in the world. Kids go to school, they read about their country. They read about their larger communities, their smaller communities. All groups do this. All groups tell stories about themselves. That we have holidays, we have commemorations, we have very elegant ceremonies, we have informal ceremonies, we have parades, we have songs, we have dances. These are ways in which we communicate to ourselves and to others who we are. And I'm interested in who's included and who's excluded from the stories, because all communities make some kinds of choices. I'm interested in the emotional content of what is most meaningful that is or is not recounted. I'm interested in the hot spots, the particular places that elicit intense emotions, because they tell us a lot about who these people are, or if it's our own communities, who we are, although we're not always self-aware of that. Often groups are engaged in material that outsiders think is trivial, uninteresting, material is silly, and yet they get very engaged. So what's going on here? And I want to ask the question of try to understand why people care rather than making judgments about what they should and should not care about. And in this project, I'm interested in the larger question that really is a universal question, is how do people and groups understand their past? So I want to use this to raise questions about slavery and race in the United States, our third rail of politics, our third rail of social discussion. Very difficult to do publicly. And it's raised in one of America's most sacred sites. And I want to just mention something about narratives. Narratives are shared accounts that emotionally make sense to people about their events in the past, who they are. And I want to underline they've got content and they've got emotion. They're not just facts. I've been asking 5 questions about collective memory. I'll touch on these a little bit, but I just want to give you this as backdrop to what I'm thinking about, but I'm not going to dwell on it. And it's these 5 questions that are up here. The what question of what commemorative memory is, collective memory is, who makes up the collectivity, who's the group, what are the mechanisms, how is it transmitted, maintained, communicated, transformed over time and across space. If you go back and read American history textbooks from 50 years ago, let alone 150 years ago, you say, geez, same place? Different pictures, different people, different important events. And how should we understand the sources of variation in the intensity? Not everybody cares about these issues. Some people care an awful lot and will fight about it, and some, and then finally, how does collective memory sometimes mobilize a community to engage in collective actions of different kinds? Some violent, some non-violent. I'm interested in symbolic landscape, and I don't have many more slides with text. Symbolic landscapes to me is what you see when you go outside. Who's present in the public landscape? Whose pictures appear in the museums? Whose statues appear on the main streets? Whose memorials do we encounter? And they're typically not typical of the population. So who's more important and who's less important? That's in part what the symbolic landscape tells us. And I want to know who controls these images and how do they change over time? How are they also about inclusion and exclusion in a society? I want you to think just a little bit about images and context. This image is probably one that you've seen in various forms, and it's not a neutral image in the United States. Now, how's this image different than this one? Same flag, slightly different colors. Happens to be a t-shirt that was produced in South Carolina in the 1990s by a group called New South that used Black liberation colors. And it clearly has a different meaning to most Americans than this t-shirt that this young girl is wearing in public. So symbols don't stand for themselves. Symbols have to be understood in a context. And I'm interested in how those contexts work. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story, what I call a Philadelphia story. We know about Katharine Hepburn's 1940 movie, The Philadelphia Story, about the upper class in Philadelphia. It was not about race. I want to tell a different story about race in downtown Philadelphia that emerged starting in 2002. So let me give you just a little bit of background. George Washington was the first president of the United States. You probably all knew this for a long time. George Washington, like many of the founding fathers, owned slaves. Probably knew a lot about that. Here's something fewer Americans know. Between 1790 and 1797, he lived in Philadelphia because Philadelphia was the capital of the United States before Washington, D.C. John Adams also lived in Philadelphia. And when he was there, it turns out that he kept 9 slaves in his house. Now, that shouldn't be surprising given his background, but the house, which no longer exists, it was destroyed in 1832, is 1 block, as you'll see in another slide, from Independence Hall. And to now go visit the Liberty Bell, you literally have to walk over some of the grounds that covered the house where Washington's slaves lived and worked. So the issue was, what story are we going to tell about the founding of the American public? During the Cold War period, it was a really simple story. It said, we're a great democracy and we stand for liberty and freedom. And you could see the Liberty Bell, and that shows that we really care about this. So the fact that Washington kept slaves on the site is a little bit troubling. Especially that the story was literally buried. It was invisible. It was not part of the landscape. In fact, Washington was at the time violating a law that was passed by Pennsylvania in 1780 that said that non-residents of the city, or Pennsylvania, excuse me, non-residents of the state could bring their property, including slaves, into the state, but only for 6 months. After that, they would be free. So Washington evaded this after getting a ruling from his attorney general and saying he wanted a ruling that would deceive the slaves and the population. But he also took care to take them out of the state at least once every 6 months, sometimes going over to Trenton, New Jersey and back for the day. So there's sort of a backstory. Washington knew what he was doing, but he did it. Washington was not the only founding father or the member of the first government in the United States to bring slaves to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia. Jefferson was a slave owner, Madison, many of them were slave owners, and they were in the government. I've seen no documentation to date about what they actually did. But Washington, because of who he represents, created this tremendous interest when, in the 1990s, Independence Hall National Park decided to move the Liberty Bell. It was in a kind of messy pavilion. They moved it for 1 block, and they built this new pavilion, and they had to do some excavation. And then an independent historian decided he would do research on the president's house. That is where Washington and Adams lived, and he uncovered lots of records, and he published this fairly detailed, some people would say dull, story in something called the Philadelphia Magazine, all about the rooms and how tall they were and how wide they were and what the furniture was. And he had one paragraph, he said, oh, and by the way, Washington kept 8 slaves. They didn't know there was 9 at the time in this house while he was president. And a guy at the Philadelphia Inquirer, a reporter who still is working there and on this story, was asked to read this by some historian and said, this is really important. We've got to do something about the president's house. They're founding the executive branch in the United States. They did a lot of stuff there, and we've got nothing. So he said, okay. He told me, he said, I read the thing. It was really dull for him. I didn't think it was quite as bad, but he's looking for the punchline. He finally comes to this paragraph on, he kept slaves there. He said, holy cow, this is the story. And they published a story that was the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer about George Washington and slavery on Independence Mall. And that set off all kinds of things. Groups organized. The African-American community got upset. Historians got upset because the response when asked to do something about it from the head of the National Park Service in Philadelphia, who was an African-American woman, was, we can't do much more than put up a plaque, because to tell the story of slavery on this block will confuse visitors who are here to hear the story about liberty. Well, that didn't satisfy the historians. That didn't satisfy the community groups. And despite the fact that this was on federal land, it produced a lot of mobilization involving the city. Eventually, this superintendent was replaced. There was more discussion. There were some really loud and nasty meetings, because once you decide to do something, it's not the same as deciding exactly what you're going to do. The historians really weighed in and put a lot of pressure on both the Park Service, the city government, and anyone else they could to do something on this site. Now, let me keep it vague for a couple of minutes. So when you have this news in this buried story, some people very angry that it was hidden from them, some people just saying, oh, we got something, we got to do something about it. The question is, what do you do? So, you know, you could probably give this to a group of people as a case and say, how do you think it turned out and what happened? After all, there is the story that was not told. There's the fact that this was a tumultuous decade, the decade of the 1790s, and an awful lot happened. This is where precedents got established that were involved in terms of the creating the executive branch of the United States. It was the decade of the Haitian Revolution, which had tremendous reverberation on the East Coast of the United States. There were laws that were passed. For example, the Fugitive Slave Act was signed in this House. The Fugitive Slave Act was implemented in Philadelphia in Independence Hall on the second floor through the 1850s, when captured or allegedly captured slaves were brought to Independence Hall to be tried to see if they should be returned. So the story of slavery is not just a story of, well, he brought these 9 people and then it kind of didn't involve the North. So community activists and some people like this reporter said the big story here is about slavery. That's what the news is. We do know about the negotiating of the treaty, John Jay, the French and English wars that were going on at the time. Washington's trying to maneuver to stay out of European matters. Those things are well known. But the story of slavery in the North, the story of Washington slaves in Philadelphia and Independence Hall, in some ways was the biggest news, and we should tell that story. And they kept saying the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But of course, the truth there is very large, and we're not sure what the whole truth is. And they wanted commemoration. They wanted this site to be recognized, and they wanted these people to be recognized for what had happened. And that's more complicated, because telling the story in terms of history and the demands of commemoration produce different priorities. And as you'll see, it's a very small site. And here we're talking about the hottest issue in American politics for a long time, an issue that we're still very uncomfortable with. How do you just do it quickly? So this was a sign from December 15th, when the new commemorative site was in fact opened. This is a schematic drawing by the historian who did the original research of what the house probably looked like from the outside. We have no drawings. We have very little to go on in terms of the historical record. It was a very large Philadelphia row house. In 1950, this is what the block looked like. And you can see the red outlines what the house, where the house was located. It was a downtown commercial district. You'd have a hard time knowing that Independence Hall is less than 100 yards from here. So this is cleared. In some ways, it was the final step in a WPA project. And they didn't realize that some of the remaining outside walls, in fact, were the walls from the original house. They simply cleared everything. This is a picture taken of the entrance to the Liberty Bell Pavilion, and superimposed over this is Ed Lawler, the historian's diagram of what the layout of the house probably was. There's a little more evidence that he was basically right. The only thing that's really contested now is in the back there. It says smokehouse and slave quarters. Now a number of people on all sides of the discussions think that the term slave quarters is not terribly appropriate. 18th century urban slavery did not look like plantations in the sense that all slaves lived in slave quarters. For example, there were personal servants who lived in the bedrooms right near the Washingtons. The people who worked in the stable probably slept back here. It's not clear where Hercules, the cook, who was a black man, an enslaved African, lived. So there's some ambiguity about the uses of the house, but the idea that they were separated is not something people are perpetuating now. And you see Independence Hall is in the background there Oh, I got one of these things, if I have to point to something. You can see it's not very far away. This is the site. I took this picture from almost the same spot on the 15th of December when they opened the commemorative site. The money was raised over time. I won't go through that. That's in some ways the least contentious thing. The city kicked in $1.5 million. Earmarks put in by the two representatives from downtown Philadelphia kicked in another couple of $1 million. The state contributed, et cetera. And the whole thing cost somewhere between $11 and $12 million, which is actually fairly small for a federal project. The historian who did the original research is all upset because it's not architecturally exactly right. The house actually came out a little further, but they didn't want to cut the sidewalk, et cetera. So you get all kinds of things that happened. But how do you tell the story? Slavery and freedom, Washington and slavery. Some people said, just tell about slavery. Hell with Washington. You can go anywhere in America and learn about George Washington. Is this a historical site? Is it going to be primarily a memorial site? Is it going to be some kind of combination? There were very contentious meetings. There were design disputes. Probably not as contentious as the designs for the 9/11 Memorial in New York, but they were pretty ugly at times. The biggest fight was actually over the interpretive materials, what to put in the site, what's going to appear as text and pictures. And I'm going to show you some of those things. They hired a very prominent museum designer. He was separated from the project, I think is sort of maybe about 6 months before this was to open. They paused. They delayed the whole thing. It was going to open on July 4th, 2009 and 2010, and Obama was going to be invited to do this, but it opened in December, and they hope that he will come next summer to the site. So there was a lot of contention. On the site, well, let me just, I'll get there in a second. Is now what I'm told is the first slavery memorial on federal land. There's a site in New York City, the African Burial Ground. Some of you may know about that. I can talk about that later. It's a very interesting site. They found a cemetery that was literally buried in the late 1980s, early 90s, and excavated this. They think there could be as many as 15,000 graves there. They removed 400. They examined the remains, and they were reburied in a very moving ceremony that involved chiefs from Ghana coming to apologize for having sent these people off in bondage, that involved going to Ghana and getting coffins for the reburials for these people. But that's not a memorial site as such. And I was told part of the reason is you're not supposed to have memorial sites on federal land. I can't speak to the law, but in any case, what happened here, I'll show you pictures of the memorial in the back. The head of the Park Service said, just do it. So that's maybe why we have it. In 2007, they decided to do an archaeological excavation. The mayor said, is there anything under there? Because no one really knew. And the archaeologist said, probably not, because there were a lot of 19th century buildings, probably removed everything. So the mayor said, what's the chance there's something there? He said, well, maybe, the archaeologist said, maybe 10, 15%. And they said, okay, let's do it. So they decided to do this dig that took 3 months to excavate the site. And they did find more than they expected, although they found nothing that they can connect to Washington or the 9 enslaved Africans explicitly. But they did find a lot of material from the time. And it turned out that the original foundations of this house were lower than they'd expected. So they did find more of the outline of the house mixed in with a lot of 19th century stuff. This is what archaeological sites look like. If you've ever gone to them, you just see a lot of rocks and you see people on their knees and a lot of things you don't understand. They did two really smart things. They put a platform up on the street side where people could watch. And they had three of the archaeologists take turns talking to the crowd. And the engagement was incredible. People really wanted to know. They knew who the 9 people were. They had small profiles of all of them, and some were a little larger than others. So they could tell the story about the people. And in a sense, these became linking objects, the way that some psychiatrists talk about. That is, some little piece of something, like the passageway from the back of the house where many of the enslaved worked, to the front of the house where they would serve Washington and his family and guests. People began to imagine connections. The most moving story I heard was a photographer, a guy who was about 70 years old, a very dignified African-American man, who was meeting with the chief of staff of the mayor of Philadelphia, and she said, "I want you to come and take pictures of this." And he gets there, and he's really upset. And he kind of acts out. He tells me the story, and other people have too. He said, "I don't take pictures of holes." He said, "I take pictures of architecturally and historically engaging and mysterious buildings. There's a hole." And yet he came back every day. And he said one day, he was a guy who studied Haitian religion and a lot of other different things. One day he's down there, and he said he just started sobbing. And he said, "I just suddenly imagined that those might have been my ancestors who walked between the back of the house and the front of the house, who lived here. And I wonder how they made it." Now, he was literally filling the hole. He said, "I made this up." But it was a meaningful set of thoughts. He filled the hole with his imagination, as many, many people did. Many African Americans in Philadelphia came there and connected it to having some kind of link to the past. You see this in the New York side even more, about connections to the ancestors. These are people whose genealogies stop very suddenly. There are no records the way we think of public records. But you can connect yourself to people metaphorically, and it served as a metaphor, as a connector that was very, very powerful. There were discussions on the platform, discussions with African Americans, discussions between whites and blacks, that were really open about what was it like in those times. There was so much shock to hear about slavery in the North, slavery in Philadelphia. People came and said, "I thought it was illegal." And I'm not talking about uneducated people, all of us. Like, huh? Slavery here, Independence Hall? And so it was something that really engaged the public. So as part of the design, this is the best I could do, but anyway, it's a picture of a four-sided glass box, and you look down, you see some of the remains of the archaeological findings in the hole that you can look into. And that's what you see. It's not that it's got a lot of detail, but people can use it to imagine some things about the house. Here's something they found that they didn't expect to find, which is the beginning of the outline. It actually goes further, but they've covered up much of this for preservation reasons. There was a bow window in this house, and there's speculation by some people, and some people say it's a lot of nonsense, but there was speculation this was the basis of the window in the Oval Office, the bow window that's there. Yeah, someone else said to me, no, they copied a house in Virginia that had that same window. But the point is it's a connector to Washington. On the site, they've used this site in a lot of ways to tell something about the people who were there, as well as some of the events. And knowing the names of the people and something about them has been very meaningful. In contrast, in New York, they know the names of no one. They found objects on the bodies, they found remains, but they do not know any names. So here you can see, in many cases, they only know one name, not two names, but they could find out some things about them. There's a picture that was done, they think, by Gilbert Stuart, and the man on the right, some people think is Hercules, who was one of the enslaved Africans who was the chef for George Washington, apparently a great chef. This is a picture of Washington and his family. This is a picture of that man that's actually in a museum in Madrid. This is a woman who is important in the story. I'll say one thing about Hercules. I should have mentioned it before. Two of the enslaved escaped. Hercules escaped to freedom, although no one knows what happened to him after he left. He left actually from Mount Vernon. People thought he left from Philadelphia, but he left from Mount Vernon on Washington's 65th birthday in 1797. And there's a lot of talk about Philadelphia had the largest free black community in the country for a long time, including at that point. And the connections with these people, because if you were enslaved in a city, you went out on the streets. You were not locked up in the same ways that you might have been if you were in a rural setting. So people had contact, and when these contacts were used to make plans, and some of which came to fruition or not. This is a young woman, Oni Judge Staines, and she was a personal servant of Martha Washington. One of the things I've learned in this project is that George and Martha owned slaves separately. The majority in the household, in fact, came from Martha's first marriage. And George Washington freed his slaves on his death, but she could not do that because they belonged to her estate, and they went to her grandchildren. That's what the law seemed to say. Anyway, Oni Judge was 17 when she came to Philadelphia in 1790. In 1796, she escapes. And I'm going to, so it's her story is here. And we know more about her than any of the other people because she went to New Hampshire and she lives in New Hampshire through the 1840s. And she's interviewed by an abolitionist newspaper twice to tell some things. And so she's one of the few we actually have a lot on. And what I've got here is a clip, which is on the site, which I'm going to play for you. There are 5 video clips. And this one, okay, come on, play. Oh, there we go. This is the one about Oni Judge. It's about 4 or 5 minutes.
So this is a tract in the private dining room in the first, towards the front of the space near
the filmmaker's talking about
6th and Market. Anyway, let me just zip ahead a little bit.
I got a clip of his clip.
My name is Ona Maria Judge Staines. The president brought my brother Austin
Can you hear this
and I
enough?
to Philadelphia when I was a little girl, about 16. Our mother Betty was left in Mount Vernon, Virginia. She died there while we were away. That's how it was with us. They move us around to suit them. Over 6 years in Philadelphia, I learned who could help me escape and how. The hope I had could have filled that whole house, but I never let them see it. Instead, I attended to Mrs. Washington and her granddaughter Nellie. I cleaned and fetched and carried. I filled and I emptied, and I sewed. Mrs. Washington wanted to set an example by wearing fine things that didn't come from Europe. They were to be made here in America. And they were, with these two hands. They called me the perfect mistress of my needle. But I was not the mistress of myself. The president and his cabinet talked about liberty. Liberty. I wanted more than that. I wanted freedom.
Ernie? Ernie? I need you here.
Coming, missus.
My brother Austin had been a waiter and a driver and a stable hand. He could ride anything. The president sent him to Mount Vernon on errands, but also to get around the law that said that if we stayed in Pennsylvania for 6 months, they'd have to let us go free. The last trip was just before Christmas time. Austin was looking forward to seeing his wife Charlotte and their children. He was something over 30 years of age.
You know I have to go, right?
They tell me that he was crossing a river in Maryland and had a seizure.
You bet the case.
They say he just slid right over in the saddle and down into the water.
Careful.
A farmer pulled him out and sent for a doctor. But my brother was gone. Just like that. When I was 22, I never will forget it. Mrs. Washington told me she was giving me to her granddaughter, Elizabeth. I was going to be a present, like some good, strong chair for her to use. Increase, that's what that meant. Increase, that's what they called it. Increase. 2 lambs, 3 foals, 2 Negro children. It's like breeding, don't you see? Any way they could to make more of us. Didn't matter. I would have been mulatto seamstress, very skillful, young and strong, pleasant and obedient. Increase. That was their preference. But it wasn't mine. But by this time, my mother had died, and my brother. Until now, leaving and then losing them. So, while the Washington family packed for their trip south, I packed for my own trip, going north. And then, one night at supper, I slipped out of that house. 3 black people, friends, hid me until they could put me on the Nancy, a boat leaving for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They couldn't believe it. President sent men after me. Big men trying to be slave catchers. Secretary of the Treasury, the Customs Collector, the Senator of New Hampshire. I was told he was planning a kidnap, except for he heard that the New England people would riot. God bless him. God bless him. So I stayed right here in New Hampshire. I married Jack Staines. Had 3 beautiful children. Jack did. And then my children. They were in their 30s. But they lived free. Don't you see? And when they died, they had a mother free to nurse them, close their eyes. When the president left office, by the way, he kept hunting for me. He never stopped trying, can you imagine? Poor woman. They gave my sister Delphi to the granddaughter. My little sister Delphi was the wedding present. That's how it was for us. That's how it was.
Let me just say that what you get here is some of the emotional content that's on the site. And the contentious part of how to do this was very much tied to the question of how much history are we going to give, and how much are we going to address the commemorative side, which would have an information content. So there were all kinds of issues about what is balance, what is equity, what's equality. And let me just show you a couple of things on the site really quickly. You can't read these panels now, but that's okay. There is stuff about the executive branch. There's a lot explaining slavery, providing some numbers, presenting some background about the South and the North, numbers of slaves. Even, see, I bet you wouldn't have guessed there were slaves in Pennsylvania at that point. Discussion of life under slavery. Washington, this is a quote from Washington. He said, "Freedom might be too great a temptation," when asked why he didn't bring more slaves to Philadelphia. And then there's a memorial on the back. And the memorial is a square building that's maybe 8 feet by 8 feet. And you go inside and it feels really like a cage. It says it's supposed to. You feel a little constrained. On the outside are the names of all the groups that enslaved people came from in Africa to the United States. And here you can see the door on the left where the man is about to go in. And then inside there are various kinds of quotes, most of them very, very moving. And one of the things I want to add is that the community groups have used this site for other things. Now, every day on February 22nd, which many people will remember as George Washington's birthday, this group, ATTACK, Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, which has been very effective in this community, celebrates Hercules Freedom Day and says, you know, George Washington might have been a great president, a great general, but he wasn't a great man, and we want to remember the people who resisted. And as part of almost all of these ceremonies, same thing you find in the New York site, are libations. The guy's got water that he's going to pour on the ground, and it's a very traditional African gesture. And this was done when the archaeological site was closed up. They put plaques in the ground, and they had an African ceremony. This is from the day that the site was officially opened. They came and also had a celebration after the official public celebration. Guy, I just thought his beard and his uniform, Buffalo Soldiers, was just great. So I couldn't help but putting this picture in. And that's the group on Hercules Freedom Day this year. And this is the leader of the group, a very successful lawyer in the city. Now, let me just raise a couple of questions at the end because I want to save time for you to ask questions. One is, think about the intensity of the involvement, the deep emotions that get engaged in a conflict like this. The anger, guilt, shame, fear. How do you get to use that in a constructive way to produce an outcome that most people are satisfied with, which is how I would describe this one. At the deeper level, what was behind people's positions? And I think we had some fundamental problems hearing for a long time. Demands for acknowledgement, recognition of suffering, of humiliation, and about connections that people made. I mentioned that with respect to the archaeological dig. It was a connecting, and is a connecting site, connecting African Americans living in Philadelphia today to ancestors and where they came from, even if they don't know the name of the town or the city. If you look at the, I think it's now 35 years old, the documentary Roots, you'll see some of that. It's there. It's why that documentary. It's not a documentary in terms of facts. It's a docudrama. Why was it so important for many people to see the connections back to Africa? It has unleashed emotions: grief, mourning, subjugation, oppression, linkage, connectedness. And the phrase, "we owe it to the ancestors," has appeared and reappeared as I've gone to these meetings and as I've visited the sites and as I've talked to people. I won't talk about what the larger context is, which is also a buried story, which is the story of slavery in the North. We pretend that in this 150th anniversary of the beginning of the Civil War, that slavery was just a Southern issue. There was a lot of Northern slavery. I'll just give you one statistic. In the 18th century, 43% of the households in Manhattan owned slaves. When I talked to this man on the screen here, Michael Cord, about that, this came from an exhibit in New York, the New York Historical Society. And he said, yeah, I saw that. He said, I thought they made a mistake and forgot a decimal point. It's an astounding number. I grew up in New York. No one ever told me about any of this. So there's a lot of stuff here that I think is now something we as a society can and should revisit. And we should ask what role can this play in fostering dialogue and storytelling, connections among whites and blacks? Will this open the space for more dialogue? We don't know. But there clearly are people able to do this. And the dialogue that went on for 8 years in Philadelphia, including whites and blacks, was very constructive around this, even though people got very upset. It brings out fears. One of the concerns of some of the people involved, and I'll end with this, is that whites are really scared about talk about reparations. And anytime we talk about slavery, it raises that issue. So one question is, why are we so afraid of it? And two is, what might happen if we talk about it? So let me stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Professor Ross is happy to take some questions. Because this program is being webcast and will be archived on our website, we need for you, if you want to ask a question, to come to one of the mics down front so that your question can be picked up.
Thank you for a marvelous presentation. The pursuit of the young woman. Do we know whether the president was personally angered and pursued, or was it a multi-state dynamic that he felt pressure not to allow her to go? And secondly, with Hercules, did he pursue Hercules as a runaway, or could that have been 65th birthday and said go?
He didn't say go. That's fairly clear. But we know nothing about Hercules. There were some reports decades later that he was somewhere in New York, but I don't think he had a clue of where to go to send anyone. With Ona Judge, he did send people. He sent a former Secretary of the Treasury. He put a lot of pressure on people, political officials in New Hampshire. But even at that early time, the abolitionist sentiment was strong enough that it was clear that they couldn't take her and get away with it. But he sent several groups of people at times to try to. At one point, I was told that someone actually met with her and tried to talk her into going back and saying, he'll free you if you come back. She said, I'm free now. So the records of these things are really sketchy. The New York site shows the same kind of thing.
I wanted to thank you, Professor, for a very interesting talk. I'm a member of Historic Mount Vernon, which, of course, as you know, is a nonprofit group. It's not a federal site, but there is a slave memorial there, and there's an annual ceremony there. Were you satisfied by the Park Service materials that were put up from what you had seen? Did they seem to you to strike the right balance between historical accuracy and acknowledging the controversy and so forth?
You have an hour? I think it's complicated. I think that this is the first site I know of that has tried to do this, particularly in a place that's so loaded, like Independence Hall National Park. I think they got some things right, they got some things wrong. One of my goals this spring is to go and try to talk to groups of people who wander in. See, if you want to see the Liberty Bell and you've come to Philadelphia for a convention, you almost run into it by accident. So I don't know what people will take away from it. My wife found some of the historical materials disjointed and wanted a little bit clearer narrative. I think they can supplement some of this with written materials. I think there can be more background. I think the African American Museum in Philadelphia, which is a block and a half away, is talking about doing something. It is physically a tiny, tiny site. So I see it as something that can be linked to walking tours, because there were free blacks living on those blocks. And some very important figures in the history of the Philadelphia Black community. The founder of the first African American church, Mother Bethel, was right there. He worked in the house as a chimney sweep at one point. So by using that as a jumping off point, I think it's much better than thinking it can solve the large problem of telling us the whole story. I don't do design stuff, and I'm really pondering, and so I've seen it for so much now. I've naturalized it, so I have to listen to what other people have to say also.
I was interested to see, just as a follow-up, I was interested to see the reference to Austin and his wife, because, as you know, Virginia law at the time did not recognize slave marriages. Washington did as a matter of policy and purposefully would not break up slave families once they'd been established by marriage. He also educated his slaves, which many other...
Well, it's actually more complicated, because when Austin is freed, because he belonged to Washington, he's freed after Washington's death. She's not, and he chooses to stay with his wife.
My final point is that a number of Washington's letters survive in which he wrote to friends and associates that he personally favored the gradual abolition of slavery, but did not think it was necessarily something that could be undertaken as a matter of federal law, in part because the Constitution explicitly protected it, and also, as he explicitly said himself in his letters, he could foresee that it might lead to the breakup of the Union, and that, of course, is what was finally realized by the outbreak of the Civil War.
One of the conflicts among people debating the materials was what is the image of Washington to present, and in fact it's mainly a statesman and whatnot. But some people say, this is a bad dude, because he did this. He kept 317 people in bondage and never freed them during his lifetime. And other people say, well, he had some ideas that were progressive for the time. And that there's a lot that we still can open up with this.
Well, thank you for coming today and sharing some of that with us.
Sure.
Good afternoon. I wanted to follow up on your conversation, the purpose of your lecture, in terms of how do you put this information, how do you present it? Can you shed a little light on how they actually came to a consensus of what would be displayed, what would be shown, and did people feel like their voices were being heard? I'm sure everyone didn't, but how did they actually come to a consensus to actually present the material the way it's presented today?
Well, the microprocess is something people have talked to me about, but I'm still not completely clear how much was sort of decided by a few people and how much was really a genuine consensus of everybody. The people involved all say they're satisfied with what's there, although some people want particular things to be different. And some people chose to be outside the meeting rooms. This was a committee that was established, an oversight committee established by the mayor's office in Philadelphia and existed through 2 mayors. They had a project director. They had an architect. They had the Park Service was on it. Historians were on it. Or community groups were on it. Political folks were on it. So there were a lot of voices. And I think it's fair to say they met on and off. And the big thing that they did decide, interestingly, was to reject the materials that was prepared by this outside consultant from New York. And I haven't seen them yet, but I think I'm going to see them because I'd like to compare them with what's there. And several people have described them to me as much more traditional historical museum kinds of things with no emotional content. So one of the reasons I showed you the video was to say that one of the goals was to put up some expression of emotion, and the color panels were to make the site more than just a set of events and laws from the time. But I think that just as people had no clue how moving the Vietnam Memorial was going to be on the Mall in Washington, we don't know what the public reactions are going to be here. It's very possible we're going to find new things and they're going to have to modify them anyway. The videos are going to get out of date. In 5 years, the technology is going to look like the 1940s. So those are issues that the Park Service now, and there's this funny joint custody. The Park Service owns the whole thing. They gave them the key. But you don't think the Park Service can just do things there without consulting the community. It's not like a rural park that's way out. So it's an interesting partnership, and I think it's a whole lot better than some people expected. In my language, it's really good enough. It's a good first start. The New York site has strengths and weaknesses as well. I think we need more of them.
Thank you.
You know, people only like this microphone.
I wanted to tell a story. It's an example of collective memory. A friend of mine from Chicago who's African American was very active in the 60s. He worked for Jesse Jackson and the Push organization. And after Roots, he got his consciousness raised and he said, I want to go back to Africa and find my roots. And he flew to Africa to a big city. And then he got on a little plane to go to a rural area. We got on this little plane. As he entered it, he looked in the cockpit and he saw a black pilot and he panicked. He didn't know whether to get off or not. And he was so ashamed of those feelings, but they were very real example of that collective memory.
Yeah, there are a lot of people taking trips to Africa these days, and in fact, a lot of visits to slave sites on the coast in Ghana, in Senegal, as part of the memorial process.
Professor, I want to just thank you for your lecture. I think it's very interesting. A point that came up, I read the Ron Chernow book about Washington. It raised some of these issues as well. I wanted your comments on whether or not you thought this would bring up further study on Washington's own image of himself as he was leaving office, as well as his economics, because my understanding of his going after the house slave was because he wanted to protect his own finances, because he'd have to pay for her because she was a dower slave, I think.
She belonged to Marc.
He'd have to spend money if she didn't get returned. And also, he didn't want to publish a notice in the paper saying Washington wants a slave back because that would look bad for his reputation, which he was very concerned about. And do you have any thoughts about whether or not these further areas of study are coming as a result of some of these revelations?
I think there will be much more research on his slaves and what happened to them. There has been research on the 9, and through records at Mount Vernon in particular. But in fact, they found the 9th person through that. I think that there will be other things that this leads to in terms of research. It's not rich in terms of, you know, pages and pages of stuff. I don't know enough about Washington biographies to know how much all that has been mined for that particular set of connections. I do know there's been fascinating research on changes in Washington's image in the biographies over 150, 200 years. Early on, he was a patrician, he was an aristocrat, he was dignified, he was king-like. And after the Civil War, when Lincoln suddenly becomes the icon of the most popular president, Washington gets gradually transformed. This is from other people's analyses, not mine. Gradually transformed into a man of the people. So there are more stories about him taking off his coat and chopping wood with people, just like Lincoln did, and being able to get down and do the work, and being friendly with the people who were the slaves. So, you know, it's very selective. There's an incredible amount of material that exists, but I don't know how many people explicitly went through the Washington materials asking about what happened to the 317 in that family.
Well, thank you very much. For those of you who might have questions that you don't want to share in the large here, we will have a reception back in the lower rotunda immediately behind where we're standing now, and you're all welcome to join us there. Meanwhile, I want us all to thank Professor Ross for a wonderful statement.
Thanks for having me.